Hello and a stormy good afternoon to all of you. I don't know if you realize why I'm here. I'm not supposed to be your speaker. Do you know that? Since the Philippine Model Congress was conceived a few years ago, I think you all know Leandro. What is Leandro? Who was the founder of the Philippine Model Youth Congress. He never invited me to be a speaker here. And while Sean told me that he's been wanting me to speak here, I said no, because my son says it can't be the son is the founder and that the mother is the speaker. But then again, I was in Japan for a 3-day conference convened by Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, and his wife, on the World Assembly for Women, which is like the Davos of women. And I just landed today. It was a bad flight. But this morning, while I was checking in, I received a call and a text from my son, please call, important. And so my son calls and tells me, Mom, can you speak in the Philippine Model Congress today? I said, so you changed your rules so I can speak now? And he said, yes, I don't think there's a speaker who confirmed today on a Sunday and on a stormy day. And just like any Boy Scout, or maybe a Girl Scout, laging handa. So that's the reason why I'm here. But perhaps that's serendipitous because first we are going to experience Typhoon Luis that will lash at us, and just a few months ago Typhoon Glenda lashed at us, and a few months ago, well, late last year, it was Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda, which in 2 months we will celebrate the 1-year anniversary. And this month, September, is the 1-year anniversary, the 5 years anniversary of Typhoon Ondoy in 2009. Why am I speaking about this? I'm speaking about this because my subject today will be the environment. It will be about climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. I know that this may be different from all the other speeches that you've heard in the past days, if not the past years. And it's probably different from all the other subject matters which you read about in the papers, which are usually about politics, about international affairs, about business, scandals, corruption, etc. But this time, we speak about something that tugs at the heart, something that affects you, the youth of our country, something that affects mothers like me and lawmakers, something which I've had as an advocacy since I was a child, since I was in broadcast for 20 years, and since my first term in 1998. And that is the preservation and conservation of the environment, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. I can't see if there are, okay, there are 2. I will read somewhat a technical scientific speech, so it's like Climate Change 101. However, I will be anecdotal also in giving you examples of why it's so important to you. And don't be surprised if once in a while I point to someone, what do you think of this? Okay. Before I start, don't get nervous. Don't get nervous. Before I start, would any of you know, or would any of you have seen a firefly? Yes. Oh, very good. That means you've been to Donsol, or you've been to Lobok in Bohol, or have you seen it in your homes, in Metro Manila? In the province? Yes. Have you ever seen mangroves? Of course you have. Have you ever planted mangroves? Yes. Very good. Have you ever planted a tree? Yes. Have you ever planted a coral? Yes. For coral reef restoration? Yes. Anyway, these are some of the many things which we do, which I do as chairman of the Environment Committee. Anyway, today I will speak about why our caring and conservation and preservation of the environment is so essential to you and I, whether we live in Southeast Asia, or in Europe, or in Africa, or anywhere in the world. Because a 4 degrees Celsius may have been impossible 20 years ago, but today, the World Bank warned us that we are in fact nearing a crisis. In fact, I would like to think we are in a crisis that, if not responded to proactively, will continue to endanger the survival of your and the next generation. According to the World Bank report, and I quote, "The worst impacts of a 4 degrees Celsius global temperature would likely happen if nations would not comply with their commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Such warmer climate would increase sea level by up to 3 feet. It would cause flooding in many coastal cities, and dry regions would become drier. Wet regions will be wetter, and there will be extreme heat waves, there'll be water scarcity, stronger tropical cyclones, and loss of biodiversity." I think that's a mouthful. What do we mean when we say 4 degrees sea level rise? Definitely, this place where we are now, which is a reclaimed area here in Pasay City, would be adversely affected. A country like Maldives, which has less than 1 million people, is already sinking. And in my visit in Maldives in 2008, when President Rashid was still the president, he already told me that they were buying land in nearby Sri Lanka so that they could relocate their 1 million people. That means the whole nation as well. Because in 20 years, or at the very latest, in 40 years, the Maldives, as a small republic, as a small nation, will be disappearing. It's not only in Maldives that this could happen. Another report of the World Bank says that with a mere 3 to 4 meters sea level rise, perhaps as high as this podium, which I'm using, there'll be hundreds of thousands of hectares of the Philippine archipelago which could be rendered underwater. In fact, in this recent trip to Japan, I got an idea which perhaps can be applied here in the Philippines, and that is putting the elevation of areas, vulnerable areas in the Philippines. Sometimes these things we don't actually take seriously, or we don't think it's important. But in the province or in the city where I'm from, which is Malabon, Navotas, Kamanava, there's over-extraction of water, and it is by Manila Bay. And so the ground is going down. And therefore, there is a need to put how many meters or how many feet is it above sea level, or in this case, below sea level. Perhaps where we're standing now, where you're sitting now, we should also include where is it above or below sea level. This kind of elevation, whether below or above sea level, is so important, especially as we recognize what happened on November 8 of 2013. You all know that the Pag-asa DOST has predicted that there would be a typhoon with such a proportion. The President, no less, went on the air the evening before November 8 and said that these will be the provinces that will be affected by a typhoon. But perhaps what the DOST Pag-asa should do is to be able to learn to communicate more clearly, and even in the local language, or what we call the dialect, so that people would understand the importance. Kung sinabi ba na meron darating na storm surge, ang storm surge ay hindi tsunami. At ang storm surge na yan ay 7 feet. And anything that goes up must come down, obviously. Ang 7 or 8 feet or meters na tsunami, I'm not sure of the measurements, I think it's in meters, would have to go inland X number of hundreds of meters. If that was explained in very simple and clear terms, in fact, ang pagpaliwanag ay dapat itong 7 metro ay pagbaba sa ilang segundo, ay papasok ng ilang daang metro hanggang dun sa SM, hanggang dun sa Robinson, hanggang dun sa may bangkong yon, ay aabutin ng anod ng tubig, ay umalis na kayo lahat mag-asabalutan. Kung hindi, hindi na kayo mababasa. Kung hindi, sa hinagpis ng storm surge na yan or silakbo sa Pilipino, ay maari kayo mamatay. Sa tingin ba ninyo, kung sinabi yon, ay gusto pa manatili ng mga tao doon sa tabing dagat at mamatay? But perhaps because there is a sheer lack of comprehension of the science, or a sheer lack of the ability to communicate it very simply in the local language, and the sense of urgency of all of us, whether you are in government, whether you're a scientist in local government, or any sector, then more than 6,000 deaths happen in the Yolanda-affected areas. Reconstruction, rehabilitation is taking its toll on our economy. Agriculture, rural livelihoods is greatly affected. You know very well the negative impact of typhoons, storm surges, tropical cyclones, and tsunamis to our economy. In 2009, Typhoon Ondoy had a negative impact of 2.7% of our GDP. Years later, Habaga, not even a storm, but the continuing rains and the winds impacted 0.8% of GDP. And Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda, if I'm not mistaken, would need $12 billion for reconstruction. And that's only for reconstruction. What about the emotional cost? What about the cost to the loss of lives you can't bring back, and the loss of livelihood, and the emotional impact on families? You all very well know, you're all college students, what GDP is. And in a few hours of rain, of storm, even just 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP is lost. And so we see that the negative impact of the lack of preparedness to natural hazards can actually mean great losses for us. Economic losses, the loss of lives, and much, much more. That is the reason why one of my priorities and advocacies is reducing disaster risk, implementing our laws on disaster risk reduction. It is also important to realize that the changing climate will have its worst effects on the poor, on the vulnerable, on the women, and on the children, a sector continuously aggravated by the lack of systematic and meritocratic system. That was just the subject matter of the 3-day conference I attended in Japan, attended by 26 countries, convened by the Prime Minister, which was keynoted by the IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde yesterday, where no less than the former First Lady of the UK, Cherry Blair, and the Speaker of the Bangladesh Parliament, and women from various sectors, from NGOs, from the banking community. I represented the Philippines as part of government, where I spoke of the importance of mainstreaming gender into our environmental programs and into disaster risk reduction. Now, in other conferences I attended, during the 17th session of the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change held in Durban, South Africa, there were 35 industrialized countries that agreed to extend the Kyoto Protocol between or after 2012. While this might be a welcome development, the agreement is said to cover less than 15% of global emissions, and as such would not prevent the world from reaching 3.5 degrees Celsius, which is dangerously above the 2 degrees acceptable limit. If global mean temperatures exceed 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, 30% of all species will face a high risk of extinction. What do I mean? It means that our flora and fauna, our biodiversity, runs the risk of extinction. I asked you about our fireflies. I used to play in my garden in Malabon as a child with fireflies, with salagubangs, with tutuwing karayons, and butterflies, dragonflies, bugs. It was just beautiful in the 60s. I used to eat aratilis, kaimito, mabolo, just falling from the trees. And I just relish those times, and I fear that you, or even my children, would not know what these fruits are and what these insects are. And imagine the impact on the ecosystem if 1/3 of the loss of biodiversity happens because of the increase in mean temperature. Due to changes in temperature, our rainfall, our sea level, our crop yield, all of these will be affected. In fact, there is a prediction that our crop yield will decline by 19% in Asia towards the end of a century, and rice yield will decline by as much as 75%. As of now, we already are experiencing a rice shortage, and we even have to import rice. And because of extreme weather events and climate change, rice yield could decline by as much as 75%. A 2 to 4 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature will also lead to a 3% decline in global GDP. And even without this, several regions of the world are experiencing their own set of crises. The Eurozone, etc. What more with the effects of extreme weather events and climate change. Now, I'm complaining about the situation we can't do anything about. But really, can we do something about it? Yes, I did. What are the laws that you've actually enacted? I would like to ask you, are you familiar with the laws that are there? And if you're familiar with it, are you implementing it in your respective schools and universities, in your homes, in your barangays, in your communities? Are you familiar with the Ecological Solid Waste Management Law that institutionalizes and segregates waste at source, recycle, and compost? You'll say, why is this so important? Ihihiwalay lang naman yung nabubulok at hindi yung nabubulok. It's not as simple as that. Typhoon Ondoy happened, and many of our flooding happens, which affects the most vulnerable sectors, including the urban settlers, urban illegal settlers and informal settlers, because most of the unrecyclable, because of the recyclable waste like bote, plastic, lata, are found in esteros and canals. Again, it seems so simplistic, but this must be recycled and not thrown in esteros and canals. Food waste and anything that's biodegradable must be able to be recycled so that, and made into compost so that it can be used as organic fertilizer. We also enacted the Clean Air Act of 1999, the Clean Water Act of 2003, the Climate Change Act of 2009, which created the National Commission on Climate Change. Before 2009, there was no commission that would take care of the National Action Plan on Climate Change. There was no body that would actually represent the Philippines in climate negotiations with the G77. There was actually no body that would assist local governments in doing their action plan. But for the past 5 years, we have the Climate Change Commission, which is headed by no less than the President, with 3 commissioners that assist local governments in mapping out the roadmap towards adaptation and mitigation. Now, the other law is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Law, which again institutionalizes the importance of prevention, of disaster risk reduction. Bakit ito mahalaga? Dahil pag hindi tayo handa, tayo na lang ay mananatili sa isang kultura na mamimigay ng delata, ng bigas, at nakatira sa evacuation center sa mga tents. We can't keep on doing this. Because again, the climate injustice of it all is, it is the poorest of the poor, it is mostly the women and girls, women and children who are most affected. First, because they live in areas which are already considered vulnerable. Second, because they are those who, because of sheer ignorance or lack of knowledge, of lack of access to information and education, don't know what to do. And so, those who are least responsible for the extreme weather events, those who have less in life, are the most affected. And I call that climate injustice. And we call them the climate refugees. And there are many of them. There are many of them who are internally displaced, not only brought about by tensions and conflicts brought about by internal wars, but also due to climate change. We've also successfully passed the People's Survival Fund, which is the mandatory law to the climate change law. For this year, we are allocating for the 2015 budget 1 billion pesos in programmed fund so that communities may have access to funds for small grants for climate adaptation. What are climate adaptation projects? Ang pagtatanim ng mangroves. And why are mangroves important? Because mangroves act as a buffer in areas which are coastal against storm surge. Why is tree planting so important? Because these are, because the trees are there to protect us from continuous rainfall. Why are flood control programs important? For obvious reasons. And it is said, for every $1 you invest in disaster risk reduction, in tree planting, in flood control, in mangrove reforestation, in early warning, you actually save $7. It's been proven in many countries like China and Bangladesh. For every $1 invested in disaster risk reduction, you actually save on $7. So I have been speaking about laws that we have enacted. But if these laws are not disseminated to our population, if these laws are not implemented by our local governments, if people do not segregate waste at source and throw their garbage by the roadside, if the youth of our country are just apathetic or do not care about all these environmental laws and don't plant trees, don't even discuss environmental issues, then it would be a big hurdle to be able to overcome the challenges of climate change. But beyond our respective communities, beyond our respective countries, what we need to do is to act more swiftly, more wisely, more decisively, to build our resilience to disasters. Because as I said, reducing disaster risk is a matter of high importance to the world, especially to developing nations where disaster risks abound, and to the poor and the marginalized who are most affected by disasters. It is very clear then that the issue of our environment cuts across age, cuts across gender and ethnicity. And without a united front against disasters and climate change, we could do little to minimize risks. I've also challenged the NEDA, or the National Economic Development Authority, to actually rethink the way we measure our growth and development. We always say that in Asia, we have the highest growth at 6, 7, perhaps even 8%. But what kind of growth did it generate? What kind of growth did it actually generate that has its toll on the health of our women and children? What kind of growth and progress and development did it generate when it focused on the extractive industries like mining and logging? What kind of growth and development did it generate if our utilization of energy was from fossil fuel and not from renewable sources? So I believe that it is time, perhaps it would be good to be initiated by the youth of our country to actually study as an output of today's session in your respective communities, universities, and colleges to actually rethink development, because you are the generation that will inherit the present generation. If we were so right about the kind of development that we are doing, why are people sick? Why are there national tragedies and disasters? Why is there so much drought? Why are there floods? We have so much water, and we have so much rain, and we have so much floods, but we have so much drought. There must be something wrong with the way we define development. And so my challenge to you, the youth of our country today, is to try to study and analyze and give recommendations on how to redefine development so that you actually input the extractive industries, the utilization of fossil fuels instead of renewables, the toll it takes on the health of the vulnerable sectors, namely the women and girls and the indigenous peoples, the lack of preparedness to reduce risk, the lack of risk sensitivity and risk assessment of our communities. So now is the time to redefine development, to change our usual way of thinking, our way of doing things, and give nothing less than our wholehearted commitment to a safer world, a more resilient human society for many generations to come. I thank you very much for your patience. I know that this is not the usual lecture or speech that the Philippine Model Youth Congress would want to hear. However, I believe that it is my duty to be able to enlighten you on the importance of caring for the environment and perhaps the challenge to learn to redefine development, a development that would bring about a safer, cleaner, and a better world for all of us. Thank you very much. Magandang hapon sa inyo.